Ever wished you could wear your favorite dress every single day? If you're anything like me, then you definitely do. In this video, I'll guide you through creating a pattern from your favorite dress and explain how to sew it by using my dress as an example. To create the pattern, envision the dress deconstructed into its individual components and make a pattern piece for each of them. I chose to begin with the sleeves. First, I tape some paper together to get a big enough piece for the sleeve pattern, and then I just take the sleeve of the dress and put it on top of the paper and just trace around it. Then I connect all those markings to create one line and write down that this is the front piece and which side goes up, and then I can move on to the back piece and I once again just trace around it, connect the dots, write down that this is the back, and then I just have to add seam allowance and cut the piece out. The sleeve pattern is finished, and next I'm going to make the pattern for the front and the back bodice. First, I mark the center of the back and align it with the edge of the paper. Then I mark the neckline, the shoulder seam, the armhole, and for the side seam I just stretch out the waistband to get the correct width. Then I just connect the dots together, write down which side is unfold and which side goes up, add seam allowance and cut it out. Of course, your dress looks different, but you can use the same techniques to trace around the piece to get the pattern. Just make sure everything is laying flat and mark which piece goes where. For the front, I just repeat all the same steps, with the only difference that the neckline has a different shape than the back piece and the pattern is not on fold, it's just two separate pieces. Lastly, I create a half circle skirt pattern with a very long waist because it's going to get gathered. Now that the pattern for the bodice is finished as well, all that's left to do is to make the pattern for the waistband and the skirt. And for the waistband, I'm just going to cut out a piece that is 120 by 11 centimeters big. And for the skirt, I want to make a skirt that is similar to the one of this dress. This skirt basically consists of two parts, the upper one and the ruffle at the bottom. And for the upper part, I made a half circle skirt pattern. And usually I don't make patterns for my skirts because I think it's easier to just mark it on the fabric and then cut it out. But for this one, I thought it's easier this way because then it's easier to align it with the print and just make it a little bit prettier. And for the ruffle at the bottom, I'm just going to cut out a piece that is 360 by 16 centimeters big. This is the fabric I'm going to use. It's still a little bit wet, so I have to wait a little bit until I can cut it out. But it's 100% viscose and it has these little wrinkles. I think it's also called a plissé. I'm not really sure, but I think it's pretty and I also like the print. So I'm just gonna wait a little bit until it's dry and then I'm going to cut out all the pieces. I don't want to sit on the floor anymore. It's so warm. Everything is finally cut out, and at the beginning I thought like, oh wow, it's going so well, and then it just took so long and it's just so hot in this room and I feel like I'm melting. But anyways, it's all cut out and now I can start assembling the bodice. So I take the front and back piece of the bodice and sew them together on the shoulder seams, and I just use a very normal straight stitch, and afterwards I overlock both seams. Next, I hem the neckline, so I just take some bias tape and pin it onto the neckline, right sides facing each other, and then I sew it together and I just sew wide in the fold of the bias tape. Then I fold in the bias tape and sew it together. At this point you can just leave it as it is, but I decided to fold it in once again and top stitch it down from the outside so the bias tape won't be visible at all. The bodice is sewn together and the neckline is looking nice. So next I'm going to attach the sleeves. Take the bodice and the sleeve and sew them together right sides facing each other on the armhole. Just make sure that the front of the sleeve is facing the front of the bodice and the back is facing the back. This seam is a bit tricky to sew because the curves curve in different directions, but just take your time and it will work out. After the sleeve is attached, I close up the side seam and the underarm seam, and I think it's a lot easier to do it in this order because then you have a lot more room to attach the sleeve. Lastly, I attach the two front pieces together in the center front and then overlock all the raw edges. The bodice is basically finished. All that's left to do is to hem the sleeves, but I'm just gonna do that later. So now I can start working on the waistband, and I'm just gonna take the long piece of fabric I cut out and sew many rows of shirring onto it. First I wind up some shirring elastic by hand. Then I start to sew many rows onto my piece of fabric, and I don't push it or pull it, I just guide it through the machine, and I always align my pressure foot with my previous row, and at the end I close up the side seam. The waistband is finished. I just closed it up with a French seam, and now I'm just going to stretch it out a little and attach it to the bodice. The waistband is attached and I just tried the top on, and I noticed that at the sides there's just a little bit too much fabric, so I'm just gonna open the seam up a little bit again and just take out some fabric and then sew it back together. The top now fits very well, which means I can start working on the skirt. I start by closing up the side seams, and I would recommend to somehow stabilize the seam because, at least in my case, it stretched out while sewing or afterwards, I'm not sure, but the sides were hanging very low, so I stabilized it in the end, and I just did that by taking a piece of cord and sewed it onto the seam so it can't stretch anymore. But I would just recommend to do it in this stage and not at the end. After this seam is sewn, I just attach the waistband onto the skirt, just like I did with the waistband and the bodice. The first part of the skirt is attached, so now the last thing to do is to make the ruffle. So I'm just going to take all the long pieces I cut out and attach them together to make one long piece, and then just sew some long stitches along the edges to ruffle it up, and then attach it to the other part of the skirt, and then I just have to hem everything. So I sewed all the ruffle pieces together to get one long continuous ruffle, and while doing so I made sure that the print was always facing in the same direction, and I'm not sure anybody would notice, but I'm just a perfectionist and I wanted it to look perfect, so I did that. And then I hemmed the whole bottom edge of the ruffle piece because it's a lot easier to do it in this stage and not later when it's already attached to the rest of the skirt. Next, it was finally time to gather it, so I sewed 2 rows of long gathering stitches onto the top edge of the ruffle piece, and then you have to pull on the 2 threads of the same side of the piece and just pull on it until it's gathered and pin it onto the rest of the skirt, and then just sew it together. Make sure you don't sew anything else because it's a mess while sewing it, and then I just overlocked it to finish the edge. It is finished, and I think it looks very pretty. It's also very comfortable and breathable, and those are just very important characteristics of a summer dress, and I definitely gonna wear it a lot. And I just hope this inspires you to make another version of your favorite summer dress. But now, without further ado, let's have a look at the finished dress. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, definitely watch this one where I made another summer dress that is also very easy to make.